Okay, so today I'm answering another one of your questions about anxiety and how to manage it from both a self-help and Christian biblical perspective. Today's question is, how do I control driving anxiety? Now, this is actually something I have a story for because personally, I had some pretty severe driving anxiety when I was, from the time I started driving, so I guess 16 up until about 21 or 2. It was like an inside joke with my friends that they would say, Melly does not make left turns, because I would just take like this one street from my parents' house to the university that I went to, and it was just like a straight shot all the way down to school. And it wasn't until I started taking, I did my undergrad in psychology, so I always knew and kind of felt convicted like I need to work on this fear. But when I got into my master's program and started learning how to help other people overcome their fears, that's when I was able to apply it to myself and see if it worked, and it did. So I can definitely empathize with driving anxiety. So I'm going to give you the checklist of the things that I did that worked, and also the things that I teach my clients. And it does go hand in hand with the way that the typical therapist would work on phobia or driving anxiety in general with a client. Anyway, so step number 1 is to do something called gradual exposures. And what that means is just little by little, instead of avoiding the thing that you're afraid of. You don't want to do that because that's just going to make anxiety worse. You want to come up with a gradual step-by-step plan for facing your fear in a way that is not too overwhelming. So I'll give you an example for me, right? I would take that one street down straight to my university. So there was one semester where I said, I'm going to take a class in another campus that's further away. It was in the next county over, which meant that I would have to take the expressway. And what I ended up doing was I signed up for a Saturday morning class in the next county over. And so I was able to practice getting on the expressway, driving, 30 minutes on it. I would practice changing lanes without really much traffic around me, and getting off and getting lost, finding the building and all of that, but without rush hour traffic. And I, at the time, was living in Miami, Florida, which is a very busy city, and rush hour can be insane. So doing it on a Saturday was gradual enough for me to help me face my fear in a way that was not going to be too overwhelming. And so the idea is for you to come up with a plan where little by little you can start moving the needle. That's what I tell my clients, but you can start just taking those little step-by-step exposures that will help you face your fear but not be too overwhelmed. And the idea is, when we're doing this systematically with a client, is to find that recipe where it's basically you'll do the exposure and continue it until you feel that your anxiety has been cut in half, and then you can stop. So it could be different for every person. If you have insane anxiety and just sitting in the car is already putting you at a level, 9 out of 10, almost at a panic attack, 10 being panic attack, 1 being 0, like very little to no anxiety, you're totally fine. If just sitting in the car is putting you at an 8 or a 9, then I would say sit in the car for a few minutes, or up until you feel that anxiety go down to about half, so 4.5-ish or so. And then you can end your exposure. And then do that for a few days, up until from the moment you sit in the car, you're at a 4.5. And then now you can decide what your next step is going to be. Is it going to be to just pull out of the driveway and go back in, or drive around a quiet neighborhood and do the same thing? If your anxiety's at an 8, let's do easy math this time, then drive around until your anxiety goes down to a 4. And do that, if you can do it every day or every couple days, whatever. Just the idea is to do that up until, as many times as you can, up until your anxiety from the moment that you start driving is at a 4. And then you can move on to the next thing, which is a busier street, a busier intersection, and working up to the expressway. And it's really best, honestly, to do this with a professional therapist, especially if you have severe anxiety. You know, if you would say your anxiety is like at a 9 or a 10, then, you know, all the more reason why it would be important to do this with a therapist. Something else that is helpful while you're doing your exposures is to practice deep breathing. One of my favorite ones is to just teach my clients to breathe in slowly and deeply for 7 seconds and breathe out slowly for 7 seconds, and just really focus on filling up your lungs, because as women we tend to hold our stomachs in like all the time and may not realize that we're not getting full breaths, and that's not good for our brain, not good for our body. And when you're anxious, if you hold your breath, that's when you get the dizziness and the lightheadedness, and we don't want to feel that, right? Especially when we're driving. So really being intentional about getting those nice, deep, full breaths is so important, not just to make sure you don't get dizzy, but also to engage your parasympathetic nervous system. And that's the system in your body that's going to help promote relaxation and help calm your mind and body down so that you can regain control of that physical response of anxiety. The next step, so we're on step number 3, and there's only 5 total, so we're almost done here, is working on I don't believe in positive self-talk because it's not really gonna be helpful most of the time. I believe in rational self-talk, which means it's accurate and truthful thinking. So again, this is another one of those areas where it's good to work with a counselor, because what you can do essentially is identify and pick up those negative thinking habits that you have about driving and start to challenge them and reframe them and create rational ones. So for example, a lot of times people will think, well, I don't want to drive because I know that I'm going to get into an accident. Or what if I get into a really bad accident and I get hurt? Or, you know, my kid's in the car, one of us gets hurt. And so reframing that to make it more rational would, it would take a few minutes, but basically oftentimes what a lot of people end up coming up with is, as long as I am in control of my physical response, the deep breathing helps with that, and practicing it will give you that vote of confidence, in control of my thinking, and also following the laws and being alert and coherent, it's unlikely, right? It's possible but not probable that I would get into a fender bender or anything more serious, as long as I'm alert and doing what I need to do, So that's just a simple, quick, off-the-cuff example of rational self-talk. But when you work with a counselor, you can really dive in, because people usually have more than one, right? So just trying to identify as many of those as possible and starting to create rational replacement thoughts. And the key here is also practicing them daily, even when you're not driving, really meditating on that truth and letting it sink in. Even if you don't believe it, just practicing it daily and letting it sink in, as some would say, into your subconscious mind, and then you start to believe it because it's true. That's the important part. And step 4 is basically the same thing as that. So I don't know why I wrote it. I put challenge negative thinking, which is what we talked about. It kind of goes hand in hand. And then the last thing is seeking support. I think I already planted the seed quite a bit here, but if you have very severe anxiety, it's just all the more important that you work with a professional therapist in your state. You can look on a website like Psychology Today and search for therapists. They have a Find a Therapist button. You can speak to your pastor and do some pastoral counseling and ask for a referral to a Christian licensed therapist near you. And so, yeah, there's just so much you can do to help build your support system and work through and overcome driving anxiety.